Hello, and welcome to today's Health Payer Intelligence webcast sponsored by Verinovum and HealthLX, Self-Actualizing Big Tech's Healthcare Vision. I am Vanessa Palmer-Desiata, Project Manager at Xtelligent Healthcare Media and organizer of today's webcast. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Verinovum and HealthLX. Verinovum provides data curation and enrichment solutions that help organizations improve operating performance. Verinovum delivers clean, complete, and accurate data supporting healthcare organizations in accessing the right information in the right format at the right time to fulfill specific use cases and achieve clinical and business goals. HealthLX provides interoperability solutions designed specifically for healthcare data exchange, including the CMS final rule. HealthLX simplifies the effort and cost of new solution integration by creating modern API endpoints on legacy systems, all while providing configurable security and enhanced level of transaction monitoring. We will begin with a presentation by our panelists and conclude with a question and answer segment. Audience members can submit questions at any time during the webcast using the question tool to the left of the screen. For all technical matters or difficulties, click the help icon at the bottom of the screen. A recording of this webcast will be made available following this presentation. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Mike Noche, Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Verinovum, and Will Tesh, CEO of HealthLX, and our moderator, Claire Farr from Envision Health. Claire, I'll now hand the floor to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. And thank you all for joining today's webcast with Xtelligent Media. We in healthcare have heard a lot of rumors and rumblings about the direction of big tech and what it means for payers, providers, and patients. But there are a lot of considerations and reasons why that digital transformation hasn't happened overnight. So as Vanessa said, we're delighted to have Mike and Will with us today. So let's jump in and get started with the first question for our panelists. First of all, I want to ask our panelists, what exactly is the vision of big tech in healthcare? And maybe Mike would like to start us off.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks to Xtelligent, and I'm really grateful to be here with Will today. We've got a meaty subject to cover. I think about the vision of big tech in healthcare directly from the mouth of a CMIO I spoke with recently. His vision, that I tend to agree with, is that you want to be able to take all available research out there in the clinical world, marry that with the entirety of the human and all of the data that is created about us, both in the clinical setting as well as in our personal device setting, and then be able to produce the best outcomes possible. Taking those insights from clinical papers and the data available on that person, bring them together to improve quality outcomes and reduce cost. That's the goal. That's what we've always said. We've been saying that for decades now. And the promulgation of technologies has just continued to push us further and further down that path.
Mike, just for what it's worth, let's start this off by defining who big tech is. I think big tech is probably the big players in the cloud space, right? They're the Amazons, the Google Cloud, the Microsoft Azure, the Apple Health Kit. That's who I think big tech is. Are you tracking with me there?
Well, I completely agree with you that that's who big tech is, and I have a beef. I really do. You know, the AWS, the Microsoft, the Google, the IBMs of the world have all made these promises for a very long time. And they were going to enter healthcare, they were going to solve these big problems, and that the rest of the industry, the clinical caregivers in the market, would ultimately catch up to the way that their innovations have eureka moments for us. The challenge is they just haven't. And we'll talk a lot today about the implications of why. It's not that necessarily that their innovative thinking is flawed, that the solutions they brought to bear is flawed. We've seen real world examples where these bold claims have come back with big promises and big public fails. IBM Watson last year struggling immensely and recently being sold to Franciscan Partners is just one example that we'll talk about today. And what I really like to think about is through the lens of the clinical health tech adoption curve, we've fallen short. And why this is? It's really about data quality. You think about these big claims being made, we've skyrocketed to this peak of inflated expectations where the hope was these tools, these artificial intelligence agents, were going to come in, make recommendations about the most deadly disease states of our society and be able to inform doctors in real time about how to change it. And the reality is they just haven't produced the results that were originally promised. I wouldn't necessarily say that we fall all the way down to this trough of disillusionment quite yet, but I think that we've got a long road to hoe before we're able to fully take on the vision of big tech unto itself. And the name of this presentation today is Self-Actualization. So I'm excited to talk about the reasons why big tech has failed so far, sort of the journey that we've been on together, and some of the remediation tactics that we might be able to take together to try to put us back on that trajectory in more real time. Well, I'd love your take on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit more in the place of the trough of disillusionment, Mike. I think it doesn't matter who the big vendor is. It's probably a side effect of their nature, right? They go to market with big ideas. They have global footprint. Anything they say is going to get the attention of their audience. But in reality, there's so many underpinnings that deflate what that idea is. And there is nothing more relevant in today's world in terms of healthcare data and where they're playing, as evidence of the Google doc that I think we'll discuss here. But it's the reality that data is flawed. And when data is flawed, you can't do things like AI. You can't do things like ML. You can't do things, forward-looking things, because you're false advertising. You're getting false information. And that feedback loop makes everything they're doing drop when success doesn't happen, right? So I think they're closer to the trough of disillusionment, like at the bottom, in fact. And in some ways, there's only improvement coming. We'll talk about that, right? And we'll talk about the hope that's on the horizon. And there is some good news. And there's people with experience in this space that are solving for some of these data-related problems that foundationally impact everything else that these big tech vendors are wanting to solve for. So that's my take on that, Mike.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. And I think about the ecosystem and how these large vendors have ebbed and flowed since the onset of the high-tech era. The federal government tried to come in and push big technology on the rest of the industry, and begrudgingly, everybody did so with the carrot and stick approach, slowly adopting technologies to digitize our world. And the advent of that effort was to say, now that we have this plethora of data, we should be able to just solve our greatest conundrums in this healthcare ecosystem. And like you, I think that we probably had overinflated expectations. When you deploy any new technology in a given space, in any industry, there's an adoption curve. And healthcare just tends to be significantly more complicated because of the two competing factors, one being the service delivery medium. You've got service professionals that were trained very differently over the course of many, many decades of years. And so their approach to solving problems is different. And the technologies that they're using to capture insights, that data that's supposed to drive these broad innovations, isn't necessarily incented to have high quality information. They're certainly not incented to share the information freely. And that's what leads us to where we are right now. And we have to be more thoughtful of what caused the quality problems in the first place.
Well, that's perfect, because both of you have touched on flawed data as one of the reasons that we're even talking about this today, and a huge problem that we're facing. So what causes those data quality problems in healthcare? And let's start with Will on this one.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one. There's so much. We could spend the rest of this session talking about the causes of data quality problems. So I'm going to come at this a bit from a more macro view and just state the obvious for all of us, because we get lost in the details real quick. The reality is, there's an incredible amount of data out there, and you're inevitably going to have data quality problems just from a statistics perspective. But the human body is also the most difficult piece to measure. And we've attempted to measure it for a number of different ways, in particular the last 40 years through HL7 standards. So in that effort, we're doing a better job of describing the issues of the body, the state of the body, or any number of side effects that the body is experiencing based on the state they're in. And this is a big deal. It's not something to be swept under the rug. This idea that the complexity of the human being has to be measured and captured in states so as to help it not just survive, but it to be maintainable when issues occur. The payers historically have been operationally focused, and they don't necessarily look at the details that, say, a provider does in terms of how they capture this data. But the movement between providers and payers to get more closely aligned with understanding care has enabled, has kind of motivated the opportunity for both actors in the healthcare ecosystem to be more conscious of data quality. And that data quality spectrum, however broad it is getting the attention, and platforms are now surfacing to cure some of these data-related problems. In some ways, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a little bit, we're going to talk about the standards and how the standards have, what standards? I'm going to particularly refer to FHIR standards. How FHIR is enabling semantic clarity. And semantic clarity means that if I'm communicating something, that the receiver I'm communicating it to clearly understands everything about that message. The intent, the content, the time it was transferred, all of it is said and received. That's semantic clarity. Semantic clarity hasn't historically been an easy objective when it comes to communication or exchanging data in healthcare. But FHIR is enabling payloads to be well described and the means to how that data is shared to be timely and well described. So both receivers and senders know exactly what data has been shared. That means semantic clarity is improving, which means any number of things. There's improvement around workflow, there's improvement around analytics, and any number of other enhancements in data. But Mike, in terms of our view on the exchange side of things, you know, the old classic, it's only good data or good analytics if you have good data.
Yeah, and I think everybody has seen that mature over many decades. And I want to comment briefly on your assertion that the intersection of providers and payers coming together has shown a light on the fact that healthcare data quality is so important. I read an article recently that said payviders were going to explode in 2022. I look at that as just another joint venture arrangement between those that are delivering care and those that are paying for the care. And they're becoming closer and closer because they realize that to increase quality and reduce costs, you need to ensure that the communication channels are open. But to your assertion, those conversations are only as good as the information available to debate how best to treat patients in a timely manner and an effective manner. And that's when I like to take a pause and say, okay, what data do we need in order to support this outcome, and what could cause the problems that we have available? I love this graphic because I really appreciate the concept of detours. It's something that we deal with in all sorts and parts of our lives. Doesn't matter if you've got a kid that's sick, like I have in my house right now, and it's throwing everything for a loop, inclusive of potentially the screams you're hearing in the background. Or it could be in the workplace that you're trying to support a patient's outcome. If you think about preparedness of data, if you haven't taken pause and thought with the end in mind, you will fall prey to one or multiple of these. And big analytics problems ultimately don't stop to think about this stuff very often. Are you conscientiously thinking about your workflow changes? Are there errors being made by your users? Has the data been aggregated in such a way that allows for flexibility for the use cases you're trying to solve for today, as well as into the future? Are your philosophical approaches in the way that you're using and aggregating that data aligned within the organization? Are you using a data lake versus a data warehouse? Are you taking a rigid approach or a flexible approach? This is where a lot of the methodology of the FHIR model, as well as the FHIR resources, come into play in the next iteration of healthcare development, and thinking through how can we get to true uniformity. The challenge with all of the things you see on the screen here is, depending upon your role in the organization, some of them you can control and others you can't. For those that are in charge of operational models at a payer level, you might have insights and understand the different use cases that your various business users have, but you have zero control over the fact that a provider is upgrading their EMR. You've got no control over that. You've got no way to have clear line insight into what sorts of changes are happening in that workflow that might change the types of ICD codes that are coming through or the way that they're doing provider identification. And these are really, really key to those downstream application use cases you're thinking about. You know, we had broad hopes that the Fed would try to solve for this. In fact, I read the early portions of TEFCA that ultimately became the final rule that Will referenced a moment ago. And in that initial set of authorship, the people in DC did a great job. Not only did they talk about data availability and passing from payer to payer and payer to provider and eventually to patients, but they also were really clear on the fact that the quality of the information was paramount to ensure high quality usage in a safe way. Unfortunately, some of that big tech and the lobbyists got their hands on this piece of literature, and all of the quality controls were stripped out of that language. This leads me back to our recurring theme. If you have detours along the way and you really want to self-actualize, you need to be thinking about this as an iterative approach. Because one thing is certain, unless you and your organization have a desire to employ, train, and retain hundreds of data scientists to solve this problem at scale, if you don't want to do that, to just have them focusing on data quality, you need to take pause, you need to take stock of what's important, what your different business stakeholders are interested in, and then ensure that you're working through what that future looks like. How can we be iterative in our design? What outcomes do we want to prioritize? What sort of data requirements do we have? How do we analyze those data requirements? Can I employ curation and enrichment tactics either within my current data streams or with the right personnel or with the right technologies? And being really thoughtful about the data you have today in comparison to the data you want tomorrow. Thinking about these sorts of pain points is going to be more of our conversation going forward. And that's the only way you can overcome a lot of these detours, because you need to be thoughtful about the things that could kick you in the butt before they happen.
Yeah, Mike, a final thought on that. And I want to riff just for a second on what you said about the regulations. You know, both of us have looked at the regulations, and as well described as they were from CMS, I guess poorly described, you could argue too. Data quality didn't exist at all in the outcome of what those regulations were. So what does that mean? That means, listen, I'm going to penalize you, provider, payer, for your behavior if you don't do these things. Not necessarily going to penalize you if you don't do these things well. And I think when it comes to data quality, that is really the rest of the story. You can do things, but you can't do them well if your data isn't well described. And these detours become as many as they are because it's poorly described. So let's talk more about this, Mike.
I plan on it. Thanks, Will.
That brings us to our third question for the panelists, which is, of course, why can even the most sophisticated algorithms underperform and, to the crux of what you were just talking about, put patients at risk ultimately?
Will, you mind if I take this to start?
Oh, go for it. Lots to talk
about
about here, Mike.
Yeah, I've got a lot of moxie, and this is the one that I'm most passionate about because, you know, we talked earlier about some of the failings and ailings of big tech, and I, for one, am not blaming them directly, but I do want to make very clear to our audience that we're not just saying this for saying's sake. In fact, Google, I like to say, another one bites the dust, released a statistically relevant paper just before they disbanded their Google Health department. And that happened late last year. The tagline in this article, or this paper, says it all, in my opinion. Everyone wants to do the data model, not the data work. So I'm going to give a brief summary of what this paper suggested, but a little bit of history first. Google was doing some internal analysis of the efficacy of their artificial intelligence algorithms, specifically applied to healthcare. And they started realizing some really weird standard deviation outcomes, in some cases 150% over or under inflating expected outcomes. And when they took a closer look, they started scratching their head and went, ooh, that's not great. We need to explore this a bit further. So rather than coming to the world and saying, mea culpa, we did something wrong, they decided to do a bit more investigation about the market as a whole. So they went out and talked to 45 or 50 other healthcare specific AI producers and did the same sort of quantitative and qualitative analysis on those institutions that they had done internally. What they found was this thing they titled data cascades. And they defined data cascades as this phenomenon, which wasn't all that shocking to me, that the producers of these algorithms, these really smart data scientists and developers, were using contrived synthetic data sets to train their artificial intelligence models. So what does that mean? That means that rather than looking at the real world and how data is captured and how data is created, and then using that information to train their algorithms, they instead said, I have a problem to solve for. I'm going to create my inputs to map to the output I want. And so when they created these inputs, this synthetic data, and put it into their models did great. They solved lots of big problems in healthcare. What they weren't prepared for, because they didn't come from this space, was the reality of the quality of information that exists in the wild. They weren't prepared to handle the litany of admit and discharge and transfer messages that come out of EHRs, because they happen to second, not just when a patient is admitted or discharged and transferred, but also when a Tylenol is prescribed. There could be hundreds of these that come through every single time a patient hits the front door. They weren't prepared to handle the gaps in laboratory messages or the standardization and codes across a singular EHR instance and multiple EHR instances. And as a result, the outcomes of all of these AIs struggled immensely. You know, the sad thing is this isn't new. We've seen this happen time and again. At every new iteration in healthcare innovation, there is a big new producer of technology that has the widgets that will solve healthcare outcomes, and lots of institutions buy them, payers, providers alike. Those tools unto themselves were developed brilliantly. The workflows were great. The insights were amazing. The challenge, just like Google succumbed to this past year, is no different. They hadn't thought about the inputs. Everyone wants to do the model work, not the data work. Will, I'd love your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are such important topics to kind of distill into small nuggets that we can share here in this webinar. But this paper, if those on this call haven't read this paper, it is worthy of reading. And Mike did a great job distilling the realities of what was done here. So much of the data that gets into the hands of the actors inside the healthcare ecosystem originates from manual input. Think about that for a second. A human being is touching something that is going to be a permanent record, and it has all the opportunity to be flawed, misspelled, misunderstood, input in the wrong field level elements. It could be anything. But all of this manual intervention of this information that makes it into the healthcare record, the EMR record, or the payer's understanding of a claim, if you would. If its origin is flawed, the outcome of how that data is used is going to be flawed. That all gets amplified when you start looking at analytics, when you start considering volumes of data, and you start running ideas or concepts like natural language processing across these large data sets to draw conclusions. And that is just not going to work. It's not going to work because your confidence in the data is bad. So prior to that analysis, you have to be investing in the ideas to clean up that data. Because as I said, it's largely manually entered. So what do you do about that? Is there hope in that area? Yeah, there's hope, but it has to be in the forefront of your thinking in terms of longer term planning, architecture of how your business is going to operate, how you envision into the future leaning forward toward data quality processes internally. Because it is a process, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, I think. All that to say this, if Google went through an effort and they failed, many a company have gone through an effort and failed. In fact, you get outside healthcare, and there's a lot of companies that wrestle with data quality as a root cause to their ability to analyze their business, and they fail. But in healthcare, there's trauma involved if you fail with the assertions you're making with the data. And that trauma is, worst case scenario, somebody dies, but less worst case scenario, but nonetheless as serious, somebody's treated for the wrong drug because they had an allergic reaction that wasn't well described or understood or buried in a record. These things are very real, and thankfully there's recognition before there follows treatment. It's like in a care setting, right? We recognize the problem, now we can treat the problem. And I think in terms of next steps, Mike, let's talk about how we treat the problem a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the word hope, and I completely agree with you. I think with every one of these ailings and failings, that isn't a dead end. That's just new lessons learned. Healthcare is renowned for being iterative in our thinking. We've gone through massive longitudinal case studies to figure out the next wave of clinical care delivery, and technology should be no different. Just because Watson didn't get the job done, or Google's health research didn't get the job done, or the fact that Epic was slapped on the wrist for having an AI misidentifying patients with sepsis. These all happened last year. So as Will mentioned, lots of trauma that's come out of this. They've all shown a light for the need for enterprise planning. We need to take that step back. We need to be thoughtful about the processes, the people, and the tools available to help us be flexible when new use cases come up 2 minutes, 2 days, or 2 years from now. And these tools for curation and enrichment exist. They take what was formerly a broken straight line or linear approach, and they're turning it into something that's more iterative, that helps us evolve within our organization as our patient populations change, as the requirements from the federal government change, as the needs to support our business lines change. And so long as we say, okay, how is it that we're going to support the future and are thoughtful about the questions we need to ask ourselves, I think there's absolutely hope for a braver future.
Great. Thank you both. That's great. So what can we do? What is necessary to shift these outcomes? Let's start with Will.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in on this one. And I inferred it a little bit ago, but I want to put some more emphasis on it. And it's an expression called semantic clarity. And it's communications 101. What am I sending, and is it properly described, and can it be received, properly understood? That is semantic clarity at its root. Now, it takes on a whole bunch of narrow use cases when you talk about data exchange scenarios, whether it's ADTs, CCD type information, CDA summary type information, EDI documents, any number of constructs that have to get exchanged, all have to be clearly described. But when it comes to the details of an EMR record, as an example, semantic clarity needs really clear guardrails in order to make sure that data is originated and received accurately. This is where FHIR steps in, because FHIR, in its purest sense, is intended to be enable data sharing, but data sharing with constructs that are well described so that they can be well understood. And the FHIR journey is still young, but the promise is ridiculous. It's very big. And I say that because there's now both the content and the means to how that content is shared, all within the construct of the definition of FHIR. That's how FHIR is intended to be used. And it's going to take a while for the adoption. Going back to the complexity of the human being, there's a lot of use cases that have to be described for data to be shared. But FHIR is going to provide the guardrails for that. FHIR is notably different than any other prior HL7 standards that have historically lived within providers to define how data is transmitted, because it enables a standard means to transmit that information. So I see the FHIR standards really being future focused and part of everybody's journey. If you're not on some part of that journey to be FHIR enabled as an enterprise, you need to start, because in so doing, I think you'll also identify where there's data issues that have to be addressed. So all of this is something I think with emphasis that you don't see in the big tech firms. And I'll give you, here's my reference. My reference is HealthAlex has been part of the journey of mutually agreed standards in the HL7 ecosystem for years. And that's where workflow standards are described. That's where CMS is listening to how they're going to implement new regulations. These HL7 accelerators around FHIR is where the hard work is happening. It's where the mutually agreed implementation guides are being created. You don't see big tech involved in a lot of that. And arguably, I would say you don't even see the large EMR vendors involved as deeply as they could, because it's not coming through in their products. FHIR API endpoints aren't getting the attention they should with large provider organizations for some of the tackling, blocking, data blocking issues, I think, that are still very relevant in the industry. Opinion aside, the nature of how these, how we shift outcomes all gets back to data and data clarity, and more specifically, semantic clarity about the messages being exchanged. Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I agree wholeheartedly with the tactical implementation and migration of the market towards advanced standards, both in terms of form as well as in function. What I love about the next generation of these standards bodies, they're not just thinking about how I make sure data is packaged, but also the medium unto which it will be used. How do I get that information to a user in the right format and frequency? And that changes the game. But I'm going to say again, I think we oftentimes need to take pause. It's not just about the tactical implications of this. It's what are you trying to do with the data? Anybody that says they're going to do all things for all people all the time with a finite data set is setting themselves up for failure. And what we often suggest to the market is go survey your business lines. If you're a payer or a provider, go talk to each of your business heads to truly understand what sorts of business value statements, the impact statements they're trying to drive. Ask your case management, your disease management, your risk adjustment, your quality measurement, your analytics, your administrative folks, what sorts of outcomes they're trying to propel forward to drive bottom line improvement for the business and improve patient outcomes. A real world scenario, we have these conversations often, and in one such scenario, we asked each of the business leaders what use cases they had for clinical data. And they tabulated all of those, and they came back to us, and they gave us 130 different named use cases. 130. We challenged them and said, are there really 130? Because when you looked at each of these row level line items, there were really actually about 30 of them. This is a different derivative of semantic clarity, because of those 130, there were lots of diabetes in control and CHF. They just hadn't been collapsed in a way that was meaningful across the organization. So of those 30, they were all comorbid, the things that you would normally expect that have high value tags to them that can improve patient outcomes. And we then challenged them again and said, tell us which of them are most important for your business today. Go look at your strategic roadmap and inform us. Where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck? And almost always they come back with 5 to 10. You know, having these specific use cases in mind that are going to drive value for the business, whether that's per a question we got in our chat, how can healthcare data push for better patient engagement strategies? We hear lots of our customers say things like, I want more real-time, more complete clinical information to aid and abet in my case managers to reach out to patients. And they're doing that because in the payer world today, they're leveraging 60 or 90-day-old claims data. If I can get a clinical data feed, because it's a really important use case for a comorbid diabetic and CHF patient, we know that that saves massive amounts of money. Hundreds of dollars PMPM for enrollment. If you do that for things like colorectal cancer screening, you can get ahead of late-stage diagnosis significantly sooner, and that can save hundreds of thousands of dollars because you have high-quality, timely clinical content to augment your current workflows. In order to do all that, though, you need to have prioritized all of your business line use cases, funnel down to the things that are most important, analyze the data requirements to drive them, with the hope that you've got crossover between case management and risk and your other business lines. Assess the quality of the data available, because we've seen in some cases that sources contributing clinical data have typos, mismatches, gaps that can make it only about 15% usable. because they're missing a national provider index number or a date timestamp or a codified element of import that ties to that use case. If you've got those gaps or you've got disparity in quality across your contributing sources, you need to run the data through curation enrichment technologies. Analyze again what the quality improvement has been, and then learn. There's no silver bullet for this challenge. It can't be a solely linear outcome where you say, I have these outcomes, I have this data, I'm going to run it through a process, give me the outcome. Because healthcare is evolutionary. You're going to get new data sources, you're going to get new EMR upgrades, you're going to have new patient outcomes, and you want to make sure that across that journey that you're set up internally, intellectually, with the appropriate processes and people to facilitate that change.
Fantastic. Appreciate it. And before we get to our last question for the panelists, I want to remind everybody to go ahead and if you have any questions, don't be shy. We do see some questions rolling into the Q&A, but be sure to send them our way if you have any for our panelists. And then finally, we wanted to ask our panelists, what can organizations do to ensure that those expensive technology investments that they've spent so much time, money, and energy implementing are optimized with high quality and accurate data? And I think we can start with Mike on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. This is an extension from my last answer. Data integration unto itself is no longer enough. We've worked with customers who've gone through many failed instances of this work. They incentivize markets to give them access to corpus of data. They tried to support and improve the quality of that data internally. They've then worked with consulting firms and data science practices. And more often than not, the marketplace has said, I'm going to look at all of the different steps along this road that you see on the slide here that are an attempt to try to mitigate those detours we talked about earlier on. But they think about it serially. I'm going to connect and get the data. And that's going to be good enough for now. And then I'm going to assess quality. And then I'm going to improve codes. And then I'm going to manage my provider identities. That's not an inappropriate approach, but it will dramatically elongate your time to value. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that big tech has failed to realize. That just because there are new types of formats, a la FHIR, and the resource definitions of how those data should be API enabled, doesn't mean that you have the appropriate lens for quality assertion on the data itself. This data problem really is deep. And you've got a challenge to make at the organizational level of the combination of process, goal setting, and technology. A real world example here. Payer combined data from hundreds of clinical sources. They had a case management division that was one of 5 business lines being considered. So case management, risk adjustment, and several others. In context of all of that work, there were some curation practices deployed by a data science team, and the data was dropped into a data lake. The data science team was then building data marts that allowed for those different business lines to engage with the data, but they were siloed and fragmented pieces of information. So when the case management team came in and tried to use it, their application couldn't pull the disparate sources of information across those data marts together. All of this work with a stated business objective to try to have more timely, complete information for patient intervention, and they couldn't do anything with it because they had thought about these problems serially. They thought if they got the data into a data warehouse or a data lake, that then automatically the right types of personnel would be able to pull it into their applications and make it go. That's just not the case. Or if that's a scenario you've lived, I know you felt the heartache, and it's taken many, many iterations to solve for that problem by yourselves. So my caution here is, and this is both the cautionary tale as well as the opportunity for the future. Take that pause, understand what your stakeholders need, and be intentional in the way that you think about this, not as a serial approach, but something that's a bit more designed and that you've got thoughtful implementation for. Will, what's your take on this?
Yeah, this is a really good slide because your expression of linear thinking comes through in spades with this slide, right? It doesn't necessarily suggest that any of this is wrong, I might add. It's just the way it's accomplished, right? So many organizations that have data issues have fundamental complex data issues. And I'm going to refer to a podcast I heard the other day where the CIO of a large health system had over 100 different platforms, all having some version of EMPI on those platforms, contributing to the EMR record, right? Well, okay, I guess that's a level of complexity, right? But each of these, points on this particular linear graph, of those 100 systems, all of them required each one of these points perhaps to be considered. Have you mastered against an identity, an EMPI? Have you mastered against your coding systems? Are your coding systems all consistent across all the different applications that you have in place? These are good stopping points to say, okay, how do we get all the data? Do we have a consistent way of doing that? How do we access data for quality for use cases? Do we have a consistent way of doing that? So this is really kind of a script, if you would, Mike, I think. And it's a place to start as part of the evolution of that organization, trying to figure out its own data quality issues, how they might go about starting that list. And that's what I see happening here. I think the next, I think the more important discussion, candidly, is how they internalize building a process around data quality. And that's I think that takes this idea a step further, quite a bit further, frankly.
I agree, Will. And I think that the way that we think about this is circular. We're referencing the difference between linear approach and compared to iterative, and the process and thinking around it. In fact, we got another question just a moment ago saying that medical errors are estimated at 250 to 400,000 a year, making data quality extremely challenging. How do you deal with this? Because it substantially affects analytical output. That is the reason why this merged process and technology approach is necessary. There is no way anybody will be able to, with a magic wand, solve for the entirety of the data quality conundrum. But you can be thoughtful about prioritizing the things that are most important to you. I want to prioritize, as an institution, the quality of information tied to my diabetic patient population, my COPD patient population, CHF, colorectal cancer screening, and a few others. And by being laser focused on those things that are going to drive the greatest outcomes, you have an opportunity to run the traps, this process that is circular. I love the idea that a standard or a standards body or a federal regulation will ultimately solve this problem for us. But we all know that's foolhardy. And the promise of FHIR resources and FHIR enablement is real. But market adoption isn't in full bore yet. There will always be leaders and laggards in standards adoption. And so what our industry experience tells us is that we need to be intentional about prioritizing the things that are most important. How do we identify those low-hanging fruit? What disease states are most meaningful? What data sources do I have available to me today to be intentional about that curation and enrichment process? All the while ensuring that you're not putting yourself in a corner. Because if you solve for just one problem and forego all the rest, what will come up when a new business line leader asks you for a different corpus of information is you're going to fail. So it's a balance between long-term visioning, process technology, and solving real-term problems. Will, what's your take?
Yeah, I'm going to put emphasis on something you said, Mike. I love the word intentional, and the corollary to me is actionable, right? So what's actionable about this? How can organizations at the enterprise level start making decisions that are actionable about improving their data quality because of all the downstream benefits once data quality has been improved? How do you do that? It is so much more about a process than organizations wanted to accept. This isn't a plug and play solution into a large enterprise. This is a awareness and visible understanding at the enterprise level, which establishes discipline on how to look at data quality for the enterprise. And there, in the world of enterprise IT, there's projects that take on some of these characteristics, but all of them are only useful when they become disciplines. And I'm thinking of master data management as one. To some degree, there's a mastering effort that happens to best understand EMPI. Every system should touch one instance of understanding of that master patient information. They call that mastering, master data management principally. But the concept is it's a discipline. Once deployed inside an organization, can benefit from having a consistent understanding of that particular data element. So is it a contributor to data quality? Absolutely. Having the right MPI is spot on. But there's many more data elements that have to be quality assured beyond that one. I'm just picking that one out because it's easy. Anyways, the net effect here is really that organizations must consider data quality as part of their fabric, as part of their enterprise means of operating. And it should be part of their future state selection process for any kind of best-of-breed software. In fact, that's what they're looking at, or any kind of software. I would further add, beyond just data quality challenges that we've discussed in this webinar, but the fact that standards around enablement, a future enablement that is forward-looking and not backward-looking, in particular around FHIR. So, Mike, those are my thoughts on this. And is it continuous? Absolutely, it's continuous. So this is a little bit tricky for enterprise execs to understand. So I think historically it's been best to describe the challenges of data quality with the implications of having poor quality of data. And those implications, of course, have real business impacts. And Mike did a great job of describing some of them at the clinical level. But I wonder if too, the concept of data quality at the enterprise doesn't deserve more emphasis.
Yeah, I agree with you, Will. We got another question saying how low-hanging fruit, what can we prioritize for low-hanging fruit in terms of solutions to data quality problems? It's a tough question because it piggybacks on Will's assertion here. What are the business objectives you're trying to solve for? Which business divisions have the greatest influence? Which ones are going to be prioritized for clinical outcomes versus business outcomes? I mean, this is a selfish call to action plug. The first step that we take any customer through is an assessment of the quality of their data. And that is in concert with us assessing what business objectives they're trying to treat for. If we can tell you where the gaps in your data quality are, there are multiple pathways to support you in solving for those challenges. Can you do a process improvement? Can you go out and get more data to fill the gap? Can you use technologies like ours for curation and enrichment to fill the gap without having to go back and muck with the source? All of these things are feasible. So low-hanging fruit is, in my estimation, a bit of a misnomer because you need to first identify what the breadth of pains are in your circumstance. I'm going to reinforce this, in your circumstance, because an epic is not an epic is not an epic, a cerner is not a cerner is not a cerner. Every instance of an EHR and clinical data repository is different. We can share with you a tremendous amount of lessons learned having dealt with billions of clinical transactions across thousands of clinical sources. But the fact of the matter is your specific scenario might be different. And it's why you need to be thoughtful about planning first. So how does this all tie back to the promise of big tech? We started off by saying that they'd failed. And what I'm here to tell you today is they didn't fail because they were doing anything wrong. They were using their key insights, their intellectual prowess to help support the next generation of clinical intervention. How can we use AI interventions to be more thoughtful about engaging patient populations? What they failed to realize was the quality of the data, the inputs to support those struggled. And so we'll say one last time, plan with the end in mind. Think about the advanced payment models that you're trying to guide against. Are those advanced payment models tied to specific disease states? Do those specific disease states have specific data requirements and the data sources available? And organizations out there like ours can help you assess where those low-hanging fruit are. Select the tools, the people, and the processes necessary to fill the gaps of what you have right now, and then build that iterative approach. I mean, this is absolutely a journey. And we frame this in the context of self-actualization because nobody's going to solve it for you. We wish you well on it and hope that we can help in any way we can.
Fantastic. Okay, we do have some questions rolling in. Before we get to those, I just wanted to make sure that you both had an opportunity to, in case you wanted to elaborate on any of the other questions that you already touched on in the presentation. So we had the question about patient engagement and using clinical data for patient engagement. We had the question about medical errors and the low-hanging fruit question, which you all kind of addressed. But in case you had any other comments or wanted to chime in on any of those, we can go to the next question. So one of the questions that we received was, how do we ensure that healthcare data breaches are minimized using the right technology? So part A and part B there. If you needed to elaborate any more on the first three questions addressed throughout the presentation, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we can tackle the question about data breaches.
Yeah, I'll jump on that one, Mike. I mean, data breaches, however horrible they are, there's always a lens of security that has to be addressed in every software selection effort or every implementation effort. And frankly, data quality to me is not necessarily wholly tied to security, other than the access point of how the source data is gotten to be cleansed. And for those reasons, I don't see it as pervasive in this context of discussion. However, I do see it in the exchange of good data, and that's really outside the scope of this discussion. But security, of course, is paramount across this whole domain, healthcare in general.
It's going to get even more complicated, and I think that's probably what our question submitter was alluding to. You could take all of your normal practice standards. We, just like every other advanced healthcare organization, is trying to adhere to high trust and SOC 2 certifications, which we abide by. The challenge that this next wave of healthcare availability is going to run into is when data starts being opened up as a result of TEFCA and the final rule, and data flows from payer to payer and payer to provider and provider to patient and payer to patient. The rules of the road about what is permitted under PHI get a bit more murky. And so that's a real challenge that I don't think the industry has fully grappled with yet. And I think the security concerns about data availability for transport, what applications are searching into your systems to pull data out, will probably have legal grounding that are a bit better formulated over the next 18 months. But you still need to remain vigilant. We know that hackers are most interested in trying to go through open windows and open doors. You put up your boundaries and your barriers, for the most part, they leave you alone. And I think that the migration of our workflows in data processing and data storage moving into the cloud is actually a good thing. More centralized data governance. There's an opportunity to support and leverage best practices in cybersecurity on a global stage rather than in local ecosystems. We think this is evolutionary. I don't have a silver bullet. We absolutely have recommendations about cybersecurity firms to consider if you have a need for that sort of support. But we're hopeful that this next iteration of healthcare data delivery and data availability will help bring a bit more clarity.
Great. Did you have anything to add, Will?
Yeah, there was a question that came up about patient engagement. And I think, where does data quality have on the journey of patient engagement? That one's a pretty relevant topic nowadays. I'm going to speak to it real quick, but the patient engagement is, for all the reasons we discussed around accelerating ideas like AI and ML, suggestion engines for patient advice, as an example, are only as good as the data feeding them. So we're going to start to see this movement toward consumer-driven care, which will allow those interested in patient engagement to get more involved. And I think it's the obligation of the providers and the payers to make sure that data getting to the patient is of high quality. Otherwise, they're going to look very inappropriate, if not dysfunctional, if it's not of high quality. So I think that's a relevant point to bring up.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's both high quality and purpose built. What are you using it for, and what format, and what frequency of a sufficient quality to make a decision? We talk about availability of information, but if it isn't accessible to a user, in my case management story from before, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if the quality is good or not if they can't get their hands on it. And so it's an intersection of thinking about the different formats, frequencies, and use cases of the data is important across your enterprise. Hey, Claire, I think we just got another question in that I'd love for you to frame up and for us to tackle since we're winding down on time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm guessing it's okay. I think I know which one you're talking about. Is it what percentage of investment have you seen payer enterprises spend on IT infrastructure in relation to other areas of their business?
That is the
That's
one.
the one, correct?
And that is
okay.
The $1 billion question, because we've heard of certain payer enterprises, large ones, spending hundreds of millions of dollars improving their IT infrastructure and enabling it for FHIR-based APIs. We've heard that. Large enterprises. We've also heard much smaller organizations spending significantly less, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So why the disparity between the two? It's less to me about percentage of investment and more about the requisite return, the value that you can drive, and getting your business stakeholders bought in to the value return. There is no false illusion that if you focus on improving your IT infrastructure, making it API enabled, and having a really robust clinical quality program around it, people, processes, and technology for curation and enrichment, there's no guarantee that you're going to get an outcome tomorrow. It takes time. You need to have data available. You need to run it through curation practices. You need to serve it up to your business line stakeholders. They need to leverage it. They need to learn from it. You need to go back to the beginning and improve again. And so it is a middle to long-term return. With that said, there are absolutely low-hanging fruits that you can lean into. The advent of thinking about case management and intervention with targeted clinical data elements to support earlier engagement with patients that then has downstream implications for quality measurement and advanced payment models is real. By having access to clinical content, you can do things like, I want to know who on my roster of patients was recently diagnosed with diabetes and also has another comorbid disease state. In so doing, you can queue up for your case managers or your disease management specialist or even your risk assessment team, who should we be intervening with today? To not only improve your patient satisfaction scores, but to also improve the outcomes that patient is receiving. So it's the way that I frame the answer to this question is less about percentage of total dollars and more about what is the value statement tied to that workflow? How much money can we save or can we earn? What is the value of improving the patient life and the patient satisfaction? And if you frame it in that way, you're probably going to come up with a number in between the hundreds of thousands and hundreds of millions that is a reasonable and viable amount of money to spend on the outcomes you're trying to drive.
Perfect. And Will, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I'd love to riff on this, but in the spirit of time, I'm going to be really short. That is a $100 million question, honestly. I don't know. I don't know if there's a way of getting that stat, at least in the way the question was requested or asked. But I think you'll find, I think it's a fair statement to suggest the most effective organizations are the ones that best understand their data. And if you don't have if your organization leadership isn't apprised or cares about or understands the depth of value that could be derived from having good information, good data rather, only to produce good information, then organizationally that's a weaker company than the next. That's my only comment on that. But I think that's very accurate.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And as you mentioned, we are just about at our allotted time for today. So if we didn't get to your question, we do apologize. You're always welcome to reach out to us. We're going to put some contact info up on the screen there. Before we let you go, we want to remind you that Veronovum has a wealth of great information all about data quality in the New Truths educational series, which is available on Veronovum's website under Insights. We'll put a link to that in the chat. We also want to let you know that Mike and his team will both be at Vive and HIMSS conferences in Florida next month. They'd be happy to buy you a coffee and talk about healthcare data quality. So you'll see another couple links come up for that. Feel free to schedule some time with them if you're planning to attend either of those conferences. And finally, HealthLX is widely recognized for FHIR enablement and clinical interoperability. So to continue the conversation, reach out to Will at HealthLX or meet him at Vive or HIMSS 22. He will be there as well. So lots of great opportunities to talk all things data with our panelists today. If you missed any of those links or simply have another question for our panelists, you can also email me. That's my email address right there on the screen for you. And I'll be sure to get you to the right person. I'll point you in the right direction with any questions that you have for our panelists. We hope that you found today's session informative and that you enjoyed hearing from our panelists. And special thanks to Xtelligent for partnering with us today to deliver this webcast. Vanessa, do you have any closing remarks?
Wonderful. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone. And that concludes today's Healthcare Intelligence presentation. Special thanks, of course, to our speakers, Mike, Will, and our moderator, Claire, our audience, and our sponsors, Veranova and HealthLX. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Bye, y'all.